Good morning, everybody. Those who are in India, South Asia, good morning. Those who are in US, Canada, North America, that is, good evening, late evening. It's 11:30 a.m., 11:30 p.m. in the East Coast time, where Professor Vinay Lal is 9:30 p.m. I think he's in California. He teaches at UCLA, so I should formally invite and welcome Professor Vinay Lal who is going to be the speaker for the 11th India Studies webinar series that I've been hosting at Flame University, Pune since February 2021. So Professor Vinay Lal is our 11th esteemed invited speaker, whose books and articles I immediately fell in love with. And I think I finished probably almost everything that he wrote, at least until, when did I discover him? I think 10 years back, very late probably I discovered him. And ever since, anything on Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, my go-to source, one of the go-to sources definitely on Mahatma Gandhi, Professor Vinay Lal, who has analyzed Gandhiji's life from so many perspectives and so many alternative perspectives he has. It taught me, at least, for sure. Without further ado, I should also read his bio formally. Professor Vinay Lal is a cultural critic, writer, blogger, and professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. I chuckled a little bit because he's one of the rare, I think, professor who is extremely active on YouTube. Also, he has thriving YouTube channel buzzing with his lectures, his classes, his addresses and whatnot. So it's really amazing to see that active YouTube channel, which is, I think, which we should probably all do, but he's doing already with hundreds of his lectures. His intellectual and research interests include South Asian history, comparative colonial histories, the politics of knowledge systems, cinema, cultures of sexuality, the global history of nonviolence, and the thought of Mohandas Gandhi, that is Mahatma Gandhi. You can see the wide range of his work for 4 decades. He was just telling me he has been in the US for 4 decades and very active 4 decades and continuing to do so even today. His 18 authored and edited books include the 2-volume Oxford Anthology of the Modern Indian City, 2013. I didn't know that was the really latest book. Then Empire of Knowledge, Culture and Plurality in the Global Economy, Pluto Press, 2002. I think I've seen that, I've read that. Political Hinduism, Oxford, 2009. Of Cricket, Guineas and Gandhi, Penguin, 2005. What a wonderful title. Of Cricket, Guineas and Gandhi, that is Guineas record, wala Guineas. Then there is History of History, Oxford, 2003. The Fury of COVID-19, the politics, histories, and the unrequited love of the coronavirus, Macmillan, 2020. I'm happy to say I've read that book. That came just last 2020. And then most recently, The Colonial State and Forms of Knowledge, the British in India. That's from Preface to 2022, probably. That's still coming up. I didn't know that book. So many of the books, but he has given just sampling of some titles. He blogs for ABP, India's largest media network. That is AB TV channel in India, Amrit Bazar Patrika, I think the full form is. And also he blogs at vinaylal.wordpress.com, which I've read many of his blogs online as well. And he has an academic YouTube channel. So where I started with his bio's last line ends with that line. He has an academic YouTube channel at youtube.com//user/Dilli Chalo. Dilli Chalo is his YouTube channel. Very happy, proud, privileged, honored to host Professor Vinay Lal, one of the most eminent historians, one of the most certainly Indian historians, specializing in South Asian history in US for many decades. Over to you, Professor Vinay Lal. Welcome, most welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Jain, for your generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation to speak to all of you about Gandhi and the gender of fasting. So I will share a screen with you because I have a PowerPoint presentation, but let me just make a few remarks first by way of a preface. And that is that this subject actually is a subject which is a subject that I've actually been thinking about for over 40 years. That is the subject of fasting. And I will begin with a very personal anecdote. I actually completed a book on this, which has never been published, about 30 years ago. And I was talking to my mother, and I've always been, let me be frank about it, I've always been somewhat overweight. And so my mother said, हाँ बेटे बहुत बढ़िया है, किताब तो लिख ली है, लेकिन थोड़ा बहुत उपवास खुद भी करना सीख लो पहले. Translating it, it's well and good you've written a book, but learn how to undertake some fasting yourself and get yourself into some shape. Now that put me in a rather odd spot, because of course, one of the most distinctive things about Mohandas Gandhi is that he never actually counseled anyone to do anything that he did not first do himself. Right? And so that book never got published. Whether it will ever get published, I don't really know. But given that I'm not much healthier now than I was 35 years ago, if I may put it this way, I am certainly more attentive to my health. Gandhi was very attentive to health. That is part of the whole subject of fasting, of course. But in any case, I've been revisiting this whole question of fasting, and on a slightly lesser, on a note which is less humorous, as it were, less anecdotal. One of the reasons I never really did publish the manuscript that I had finished about 30 years ago, and I'll tell you the circumstances under which I started it, because again, that will give us some segue into the things that I'm going to talk about. One of the reasons I never did publish it is because when I had completed writing the manuscript, which is about 450 pages, the most detailed study of Gandhi's fasting, and incidentally, no one has ever actually written a book on Gandhi's fast. People have written on this or that fast, his last fast, the fast that he undertook in 1932, following what was called the Pune Pact, the communal award, and so on. What is really astonishing to my mind is that no one has actually ever written a book on the subject. But when I completed the manuscript, I became aware of the fact that there was a vast literature that was essential to look into, which had to do with a great many subjects that I knew nothing about. And that is what I've been exploring in the last 30, 35 years. And that includes the anthropology of food, the anthropology of hunger, right? The anthropology of the body. All of this is absolutely essential if one is going to understand the ethics, politics, and socio-cultural conditions of Gandhi's fasting, his praxis of fasting. So let me share the screen with you, and we'll take it from there. Okay. All right. So this is the this talk, as I've indicated to you, is a talk which is structured around the question of Gandhi's politics of fasting, but I want to be particularly attentive to the question of gender. And the way I've structured the talk really is the following. I'm going to make first, you can think of it in several parts. The first part is where I make some very general observations about how to really think about fasting, or what some people call hunger striking. I'm going to suggest the two are actually not the same. We should be very attentive to the words and the vocabulary that we deploy. And Gandhi was very firm in his mind that fasting and hunger striking are in fact very different. Although, as you will find out, the vast number of commentators actually make no distinction. And I think in the popular imagination, there's almost no distinction between the two. Then I want to look really at what we might call traditions of women's fasting, but I extend the discussion from India to Europe, going back into the European Middle Ages, for reasons that you will see, to understand what are some of the contexts in which we think about women's fasts. And I mention this because one of the reasons I became very interested in the question of fasting was that in the 1980s, you hear about it, you don't hear about it much now. In fact, you don't hear about it at all today. But in the 1980s, the question of anorexia had become exceedingly important in the public sphere in the United States. There were a large number of women, young women, who were suffering from either bulimia or anorexia. And a feminist literature started to develop around the question of anorexia. Anorexia is where women essentially, if I may put it in the simplest terms, would be where women actually eat very, very little. And when they do, they usually go on a binge. And the argument that was very often given by feminists was that this was influenced by these, these young women were being influenced by these supermodels who were exceedingly slim. Um, uh, there were other arguments that were advanced as well. I can't get into the whole discussion about anorexia, but it was really very common. And then a very interesting feminist literature developed on anorexia that is largely the abstention from food, which went back into the European Middle Ages. And I will engage with some of that literature because it helps us actually understand some of the complexities of thinking about the politics of the body, particularly the politics of the female body, in a very different vein than it's usually discussed. And then I want to really, in the last section, I really move on to a discussion of Gandhi and Satyagraha and the women's role in Satyagraha and what Gandhi learned from women's practices of fasting. Right? So this is really how the talk is structured. Now, it needs to be said unequivocally that Gandhi was the master of the fast, not just the master of the modern fast. I think in history, there has never really quite been a practitioner of fasting of the kind that Gandhi was. We certainly don't know of anyone who was so rigorous in the practice of the fast. And we can think of Gandhi engaging in both what you might call a more domesticated form of fasting. And you will see that I'm going to put into question many of the categories that I myself am invoking right now. When I say a more domesticated kind of fasting, I'm talking about what you might describe as habitual fasts. So every week, for example, he might go without food for 1 day. He never ate after 5 p.m., certainly never after sunset. This was a very rigid principle that he observed for several decades, for the vast duration, I would say, of his life, right? And then you can think of course, a fast that had certain kinds of political implications. Some people will simply refer to them as political fasts. But what is very clear is his principled use of the fast in the public domain over the course of 3 decades. We could say perhaps a little bit longer, but certainly 3 decades, beginning with a fast that he undertook in Ahmedabad in 1917, and his last fast, which was really just a few days, literally 10-15 days before his assassination on January 30th, 1948. Now, when Gandhi fasted, we also have to understand, and all you really have to do is to read the newspapers of that day. You have to read memoirs of that day. You have to read autobiographies of that day. That when Gandhi fasted, it was a phenomenon. A phenomenon. Much of India would come to a standstill, particularly when Gandhi went on a fast unto death, or when he stipulated a period of 21 days. Now, when he was somewhat younger, when he was in his 50s, 21 days meant something else than what it meant when he was in his early 70s. Because when Gandhi went on a fast for 21 days, when he declared that he would go on a fast for 21 days, it meant that he had to go on that fast for 21 days. He couldn't terminate it earlier. And in principle, those fasts were far more dangerous to him than fasts unto death, such as the fast he undertook in 1932, which was a fast unto death. Because in principle, that fast could have extended well beyond 21 days, but what we find is that these fasts unto death, in fact, actually lasted often no more than 4 or 5 or 6 days. They concluded there because when Gandhi went on a fast unto death, it would energize the entire country. And when I say that when Gandhi fasted, much of India would come to a standstill, you also read of records of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, millions, who themselves would give up eating for a portion of that time. They might eliminate 2 meals in the day out of 3. They might go on a fast for half of the time that Gandhi went on a fast, but they fasted alongside him. And these are all the reasons why George Orwell, was among many who marveled at all of this and asked, and here I quote from his essay published in 1948, a wonderful essay. It's difficult to agree with everything that he says, but nonetheless, it's a very reflective, thoughtful essay, where he asks, to what extent was Gandhi moved by vanity, by the consciousness of himself as a humble, naked old man sitting on a praying mat and shaking empires by sheer spiritual power, including the power of the fast, right? I also want to share with you some very rare images. There are 3 images that I will share with you. I won't comment on them at length. I've done that so in a book which is coming out later this year on the art of the freedom struggle in India. But these woodcuts are by Dhiren Gandhi, who was related to Gandhi and who observed Gandhi at very close quarters. He lived at the ashram. The ashram always means in Gandhi literature, not just generically the ashram, because there were several ashrams, but it also refers specifically to Satyagraha ashram or Sabarmati ashram in Ahmedabad. So he spent some time there as well, Dhiren Gandhi. And these are woodcuts that he produced. He produced a series of 6 woodcuts. And here you see Gandhi here lying on a cot. He's recovering from a fast, and there's a child who's come forward, the light bringer. That's what the caption says. So this beautiful woodcut is also, of course, about the child as the bringer of light, the sustainer of life, in his or her own way. We'll look at the other 2 in just a moment. But I had mentioned to you before, and I now want to dwell on that point a little bit, that we have to make a distinction between the fast and the hunger strike. I myself really became aware of this distinction, of course, in reading Gandhi, but I also became aware of it, and this is in fact what actually started me on this enterprise over 4 decades ago. I was living in Baltimore in 1981. I was a student at the Johns Hopkins University, where I was completing a BA and MA. And at that point, someone by the name of Bobby Sands. So Bobby Sands was a member of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and he went on a hunger strike. And this became news all over the world, partly because this was a very prolonged hunger strike. The Irish have a long tradition of this, a very long tradition. Back in 1920, there was Terence McSweeney, the Lord Mayor of Cork, who went on a hunger strike. And his name resonated, not just in Ireland, it resonated all over India. Jawaharlal Nehru wrote about Terence McSweeney. Lajpat Rai, Chittaranjan Das, every single Indian nationalist was entranced by this man's life. And now in 1981, and Terence McSweeney died. He died around the 90th day. It was the longest hunger strike ever recorded. And so now in 1981, once again, we had this phenomenon of Bobby Sands from the Irish Republican Army. I can't obviously get into the whole conflict in Ireland, but there were circumstances under which he had undertaken this hunger strike. And I remember reading an editorial at that time in the Baltimore Sun, which suggested that even though people were talking about Bobby Sands in the same way in which they had been talking about Gandhi, the writer of this editorial, Gary Wiltz, a major American commentator, suggested that there was a difference between the two. And that's what really set me into exploring this whole subject. So there is a common association that people make between fasting and hunger striking. In Gandhi's view, the two are quite distinct, whatever the common tendency to conflate them. And Gandhi was very clear that fasting is to satyagraha what duragraha, what hunger striking, sorry, is to duragraha. Okay, so duragraha is holding on to falsehood, just as satyagraha is clasping on to truth, firmness in truth. And Gandhi is very clear that fasting is to be resorted to after all other remedies have failed. All other remedies. You don't begin with, certainly with a fast, right? So a proper assessment of this question, which I'm not able to deliver at this juncture because it's really the subject of the book and it would take several hours to get into it. A proper consideration of this subject of fasting would involve a consideration of what is the place of violence in Gandhi's thinking about fasting. What is his conceptualization of what he called the inner voice, right? The antar-atma. There are a number of words that are used, but certainly that is one of the indigenous categories. And the inner voice was very important for Gandhi because often he would say that he only undertook a fast when his inner voice told him that he should now do so, right? We'd also have to consider the notion of inner cleansing, which was involved in the process of fasting. We'd have to consider whether fasting was in its own way a form of coercion, something that Gandhi denied. Of course, there might be inadvertent coercion, much in the way in which some killing is unavoidable in every human life. If you're a strict vegetarian, well, you pluck. Okay, you pluck the well, pluck is perhaps not the right word. Yes, you could pluck, roots, right? Root vegetables, but even when you take, let's say, a green vegetable, right? Well, if you believe that plants are living things, which they are, and they have life, and that they may have sensibilities, perhaps, well, that's a form of violence too. But to some degree, it's unavoidable. And Gandhi was quite clear in his mind that a fast may coerce someone into doing something, but that Gandhi certainly never intends it as a form of coercion. And there's a very serious question about whether Gandhi actually intended to actually ever really influence anyone as such through his fasting. Now, people may get influenced by his fasting, but whether that was what propelled him to undertake a fast is, I think, a different question. And of course, fasting and hunger striking, that may be one common ground, perhaps in certain ways, both involve self-mortification. And if you look at this, this is another woodcut from Dhiran Gandhi. So here you can see the fasting Gandhi. This might remind some of you who are familiar with art. It might remind you of the Buddha, right? There are these extraordinary sculptural pieces, largely from the Gandhara period of the fasting Buddha, the Buddha who really engaged in self-mortification. And you see his rib cage, and this looks very much like that. But this is, of course, is also an image of Rai Chand Bai, a very famous ascetic who was a contemporary of Gandhi. Gandhi had a long correspondence with him as well, right? But this is anyhow a woodcut by Dhiran Gandhi, which shows a fasting Gandhi. The Sanskrit here says Santo Bhumi Tapsa Dharyanti. That is, the sons, the saints, right, can possess the world, the earth, Bhumi, through their tapasya, through their sacrifice, through their power of discipline, right, from the Mahabharata here. And there is a final woodcut here. And this is a woodcut where Gandhi, the fasting Gandhi, Gandhi has just broken a fast. And here you see Kasturba, his wife, giving him a glass of liquid, some water. Usually it would have been a glass of water with a few drops of lime juice, with which he broke his fast. Now, what were Gandhi's fasts in the public sphere? So most scholars mention 17 such fasts. Some scholars mention a different number, a few mention 18 or 19, but usually 17 fasts, including 2 penitential fasts that he undertook in South Africa. Notably, there is his first fast in Ahmedabad, as I mentioned to you before, in connection with a strike by mill workers. There is a fast for Hindu-Muslim unity in 1924. There were several such fasts. There were also fasts undertaken on behalf of the Harijans, or today we would call them the Dalits. The fast unto death when the communal award was issued in 1932. I can't discuss any of these fasts because that's not really the subject of the talk, but this is just to give you an overview of Gandhi's practice of fasting and what were the various occasions that prompted him to fast. A fast in his native Rajkot, which he undertook in 1939, and then the last fast, just days before his assassination, where he attempted to bring communal harmony into the city of Delhi. What were the duration of these fasts? I've already addressed the subject. Some were of 21 days duration, some were a fast unto death, some were of a shorter duration, a week. Very few, if any, were ever set to a duration of less than a week, although some of the fasts unto death actually concluded, like the communal award, in 4 to 5 days. It is very conventional to ask, and increasingly I am becoming aware of the fact, and that means that I've had to rewrite this manuscript now, which I had completed decades ago. It's very conventional to ask, who were these fasts directed against? I'm no longer certain that this is actually that important a question, although it would essentially take away much of the scholarship that has been written on Gandhi's fasts, because it's very clear that many of these fasts were directed by Gandhi against himself. That is, that these were ways of where he set himself a regimen of discipline and penance, right? It was his way of intensifying experience, the experience of God. And in this connection, it is also important to ask, when did Gandhi not fast, though he was expected to fast by others? Of course, one such instance is the partition. And those who think he should have fasted, I dare say, do not at all understand Gandhi's idea of fasting. Right? But it's important to ask, when didn't Gandhi fast? There were occasions when he thought of fasting, but then thought the better of it and didn't fast. Right? So that's another way to really think about it. Now, so what prompted Gandhi to undertake a fast? How did he get on this road, so to speak? So the first thing is to understand the tradition that he disavowed. And for those of you who are impatient about wanting to hear about gender, I'm coming to that very shortly. Right? But what is the tradition that he disavowed? And this is absolutely fascinating subject, because there is actually the practice of dharna, which is attested to by a great many ancient texts. The practice was widely prevalent, and there is reference to it, in fact, in the Ramayana, among many other texts, in the Valmiki Ramayana. The practice of sitting dharna seems to have been an Indo-Aryan, Indo-Celtic institution. And Sir Henry Sumner Maine was among those writers in the 19th century who actually pinpointed what they found to be similarities between the practice of sitting dharna. It was not called this, of course, in Ireland, but that's exactly what it was, a practice of sitting dharna both in India and in Ireland. So what I'm saying is that the modern history of fasting and or hunger striking, which you find in Ireland, has parallels in an older history in Ireland and in India, right? So the word dharna, I'm sure all of you are familiar with it, because if you know modern Indian politics, you know that people go on a dharna, they sit on dharna. So to sit dharna means to actually become an obstacle. Let's say you sit outside someone's door, you have a grievance against that person and you refuse to move, right? Now, what the literature suggests is that fasting, upavas, abhojan, there are numerous words for it, was a concomitant of sitting dharna. That is, that it follows. To sit dharna, to be an obstacle, meant also to abjure food, to abstain from food. If you're sitting dharna for 10 hours, it meant that you were not eating for 10 hours as well. and that no one was bringing food to you. Now, what the ancient texts reveal very clearly is that sitting dharna could become a duel. What is the scenario that I'm referring to? Very simple illustration. I take a loan from a person and I agree to pay the loan back in 6 months. 6 months have passed by and I haven't paid the loan. So the lender comes to me and says, you owe me some money. And I say, I'm not in a position to pay you. Or I simply say, I never took the loan from you. So what does that person do? He sits dharna. But what if that person is making a false claim? What if you didn't take a loan and someone is making a false claim and sits dharna? Because when someone comes and sits dharna, then eventually people get to know and they say, this person has a grievance against, a legitimate grievance. But what if it's an illegitimate grievance? Then what I do is I sit dharna against the person who's sitting dharna against me. So we both sit and both of us refuse to move and thereby refuse to eat. It becomes the equivalent of a medieval duel. Number of texts talk about that. Now, you can see, by the way, how far removed this is going to be from Gandhi's notion of fasting as a form of penance, as a form of inner cleansing, etc. And sometimes what these texts suggest is surrogate fasting. If someone wants to sit dharna but says, I don't really have the energy for this, I don't have the spiritual practice for it, and frankly, I'm not going to give up my laddus and my samosas, I hire someone to sit in my place, and that's surrogate fasting. And unbelievably, the texts are rich in detail about this. And for those of you who are interested, even casually, in popular Hindi cinema, for the first time in my 4-decade-old experience of viewing seriously Indian cinema, I found a film which I saw just a few weeks ago, Jolly LLB 2. This is the second movie, and there was a Jolly LLB. It's a very interesting and funny film. And here you have a person sitting dharna, and then the judge himself sits dharna as well. So here you have that duel. This is shown in this Hindi film from 2017. This tradition Gandhi entirely disavowed. Entirely disavowed. All right. But then there was the example of his mother, Putli Bai, and Gandhi talks about her in the autobiography, right? That she was a very deeply religious woman. She left an enormous impression on him. And he says that in the first few pages of his autobiography. And he continues, to keep 2 or 3 consecutive fasts was nothing to her. And during the months of the rain, she would eat 1 meal a day, although 1 year she decided to eat only on alternate days during those months. So he gives you a little bit more detail about that, right? So what did he learn from her? Gandhi learned a lot from the women around him, not just his mother. I think that is unquestionably the case, right? He says, however, that his fasts, that he had watched his mother and he started fasting later on, but that his fasts were imitative, that he didn't really understand what was really involved in the praxis of fasting. What is a conception of the self? What is a conception of penance? What is a conception of the body? What is a conception of cleansing, of purification? What form of communication does one enter into with God through the process of fasting? But nevertheless, it's important to ask, could her fast have been the first lessons in Satyagraha for him? And he says, and then his biographers, including early biographers such as D.G. Tendulkar, I refer to him as early. Of course, there were much earlier biographers than him, but he's the one who wrote that 8-volume huge biography called Mahatma. More than half of it is just quotations actually from Gandhi's writings, but nonetheless, it's a very detailed record of his life. And he mentions 3 penitential fasts that Gandhi undertook in South Africa. Gandhi mentions 2 of them in his autobiography, right? That it was in 1912 at Tolstoy Farm, Gandhi says that he learned that fasting was necessary for self-restraint. So now he's becoming a bit more reflective about it, in the same way in which he had been a vegetarian for many years, but he didn't really understand the basis of vegetarianism. And remember that it is in London that he discovers vegetarianism in a different way. He actually writes for a journal called The Vegetarian, right, in London. Those are some of his very early writings, right? So the example of his mother is very important to him. Now, we start to get into the socio-cultural politics and ethics of fasting. I've already hinted at this very briefly, and I said that in order to do a comprehensive, systematic study, one would have to look at all of these kinds of questions in substantial detail. Because think of it this way. You see, a Gandhi fasting. Let's say there's a great famine going on, and Gandhi is fasting. Well, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are just dropping off like flies. And India underwent in the British period devastating famines. I mean, the British have a lot to answer for, because some of these famines were famines that undoubtedly got considerably worse and exacerbated by the dominant economic doctrine of laissez-faire, where the British simply refused to do anything, right? So that the period from 1875 to 1925 is really what I call a half a century of catastrophic death, with 100 million excess deaths from famine, from plague, from cholera, from epidemics of all kinds. But the point is simply this, that what would it have meant for Gandhi to have gone on a fast, for example, in those circumstances? Because to go on a fast means to also become hungry in a different way. It means to deprive yourself. But there are people who are being deprived of food all the time, right? And that is why it's going to be important to understand the history of hunger in India and to distinguish hunger and famine from self-starvation. Now, there's a long practice of self-starvation in India. Professor Jain can enlighten lots of people because one of his areas of specialization is Jainism. But there is a practice called Salekhana. And sometimes it's described as a ritual fast to death, but that when a Jain is preparing, particularly a Jain monk is preparing for death, so to speak, one of the ways in which you prepare for it is you slowly start to wean yourself away from food. Vinoba Bhave is thought to have done something of that kind, right? Is it a preparation for shedding the flesh? Again, a very detailed discussion of this is not possible at this juncture, but there is a whole literature on this practice, right? And we obviously have to look, just as we look at the anthropology of hunger, we'd have to look at the anthropology of food, the anthropology of the body, of women's bodies, of men's bodies, of the bodies of saints, all of that, right? Now, I get to this subject of food and women's work. See, there is a long association between food and women's work across cultures. Across cultures. Elia Canetti, a fantastic writer, a great sociologist, one of the greatest European intellectuals of the 20th century, wrote this extraordinary book called Crowds and Power. Every page is very dense. And he says, in a family, the husband contributes food and the wife prepares it for him. The fact that he habitually eats what she has prepared constitutes the strongest link between them. This begins with pregnancy and continues through lactation. A mother is one who gives her own body to be eaten, right? Not only to the infant, that's what he's saying, that the woman is the nourisher, right? And this is a point elaborated upon by the feminist Susie Orbach, who in her book on anorexia and hunger striking, published in the 1980s, said that the mother is always implicit in food, which in turn becomes a representation of the mother. From the child's point of view, the essence of its mother is distilled through food. The mother is the one who supplies the food. The mother's personality comes to fruition in the meals she prepares. And that is, of course, one of the origins of this kind of nostalgia we all have for our mother's cooking. You know, in nearly every culture, the preparation of food at home is left largely to women. Of course, there are many other contexts which I don't need to get into where that is not the case, particularly when it's paid labor. So the chefs at restaurants, or in India, the word chef is a lofty word. I mean, all the dhabas, the persons who are doing the cooking are men, not women, and the vast, vast majority of them. But that's paid labor, as opposed to the unpaid labor of women at home, right? Now, there is a power that women came to have through food. And this is where I'm going to have to, I realize that I'm going to really speed up quite a bit because I want to conclude in 20 minutes so that there is enough time for discussion. So I'm going to really summarize the next number of slides very quickly. But in the Middle Ages in Europe, see, what are the origins of anorexia? Anorexia is where a woman basically gives up eating food, sometimes to the point that she suffers from amenorrhea. That is, that she's not capable of having menstruation, even as a young woman. Right? In the Middle Ages in Europe, there's a fantastic book by Carolyn Bynum, Holy Feast and Holy Fast. And what she's studying here is she's studying the condition of women in Europe, because she was intrigued. Why were there so many women who became nuns? And the reason for that is very simple, that if you were a woman, it was expected that as you matured into an adult, there was only one outcome for your life, one outcome. That is that you would get married. You would get married and then you would bear children. And if you wanted to escape that, there were only two ways in which you could escape it. You could become a nun, or you could become anorexic. Right? It's a strategy deployed by women. That is that they become so thin from not eating food that they become unattractive to men and incapable actually of bearing children, because they become actually get into amenorrhea. This is cessation of menstruation, which is different than what happens when you become pregnant, the bodily process, right? So this is what she's really describing. And then what she does is she begins to describe, so what is the other way, if possible, that women had leverage against men, against their fathers, against their husbands. And one other way that they had leverage was through their power of controlling food, the production of food, the distribution of food, serving the food, and what they would mix into the food, right? How they would actually, the women would prepare the food, and sometimes they would give it to strangers, and there wouldn't be any left for the home, which would create a revolt in the home. The menfolk would get livid. She describes all of these kinds of situations, right? Because she's saying that this is the only power they had, was the power of food. Now, and when we're thinking of fasting, we have to think of food. We have to, you can see the connection there, right? So she has a considerable discussion, and there's of course other literature, because this book goes back to the 1980s. There's other literature which has now moved in the same direction, which has looked in very great detail at the life of these, women in medieval Europe. And one of the things that is suggested is that we need to have a far more complex understanding. They give us a very complex understanding, but there's new insights into this, because one of the things that has now been argued in the more recent literature is that fasting was actually a way for women to bypass the clergy, to usurp clerical authority, and even to take on the role of the clergy. That is, that what was happening was that men were slowly relaxing the rules. There were very strict rules for fasting. In Europe, there were so many fasting days associated with Christianity that literally 100 days of the year you might be fasting. Now, many of the men were starting to give that up. The women, on the other hand, are getting more rigorous in the preservation of these days, and they're adding more days to the fasting calendar. To Catherine of Siena, a great medieval mystic, survival without eating was characteristic of what she called the perfect, right? And I take a modern day example, which I'm going to have to completely overlook now in the interest of time, and that's the example of Simone Weil, one of the most extraordinary, majestic figures from the 20th century, a French philosopher, a woman who basically starved herself to death, partly in sympathy with those who were actually hungry. And during World War II, there were, of course, millions who were hungry. Now, if we had to start getting into the more detailed examination of what I'm calling the gender of fasting, I've talked about women, I've talked about traditions of fasting, the politics of fasting broadly. We can think about the fasts of women. What scholars have typically done is they've thought about the fasts of women and then the fasts of men. The conventional literature says that the fasts of women were domestic, they were ritualistic, they were undertaken for the benefit of husbands, sons, and sometimes the family in general. In India, for example, many people would be familiar with the Karwa Chauth, which is a fast undertaken by married women, right? For the well-being of their husbands. There are many other such fasts, incidentally, right? So these are the fasts of women, according to this literature. Then there are the fasts of men, distinguished from the fasts of women because these fasts are said to be public. Fasts undertaken by men to increase their own purity, not undertaken for the welfare of their wives or the welfare of even their families, but to increase their own public standing, their public eminence, right? Their purity, and sometimes undertaken as a form of political protest. That's a conventional distinction that has been made. And what I am going to argue is that Gandhi in every way tried to undermine this distinction. Right? So what is the tradition of women's fasting in India? Let's take the conventional view a little bit further. Let's get into it just a bit more. So Bynum, for example, argues that fasting as a religious activity is, sorry for the omission of that word, is done primarily by women, though fasting as a scientific experiment or as political protest is usually performed by men. And you can see where she makes the split between the two. In a way, it's rather odd that she should do so, as I point out, because what she has demonstrated in her book is that women's fasts, anorexia, was intensely political. It was intensely political, right? It is a way of creating a separate social sphere for women, where they're not tied into the domesticity of marriage. Right? Now, the anthropologist Jack Goody has argued that, quote, whereas men's fasts are mostly directed towards improving or upholding their own purity and spiritual status, as I pointed out, the fasts of women are largely aimed at enhancing and maintaining the auspiciousness of the social collective, that is, undertaken for the benefit of the family. So does this conform with the reading I have advanced thus far of how to interpret Bynum? I'm suggesting that there are some difficulties here. Are women's fasts in India only innocuously domestic, familial, self-sacrificing, and devoted to the cause of the family? Now, let me just pause here for a second, because you might think to yourself, all right, so what would a man's fast be like? So let's take one of Gandhi's fasts. For instance, the last fast, undertaken in January 1948 and terminated 10 days before his assassination, really, on 30th January of that year. Why did Gandhi undertake that fast? Now, if you read Nathuram Godse's account, Nathuram Godse is the assassin. The last slide, we return to him. Nathuram Godse says that, well, it was because of Gandhi that 55 million rupees, which was what was owed to India, that was after 1947, after the partition, after the Indian Independence Act and the creation of Pakistan and the birth of India as a new nation, free from colonial rule, a certain portion of the revenues of the Indian government had to go to Pakistan. India withheld this money because of what happened in Kashmir. And Godse says that Gandhi undertook this fast because the Indian government was withholding this money, and Gandhi said, this is wrong. We owe this money to them. The Indian government, of course, withheld the money. So the argument goes, because Pakistan was already at war with India, the argument was that Pakistan would simply use the revenues to enhance its military strength. It would use it to buy arms, to continue to wage war against India. So why shouldn't India withhold the money? Now, I can't get into the details of it, but you can see what, quote, a political fast, this is at least how Nathuram, Godse, is interpreting it, that Gandhi fasted to make the Indian government pay up this money. And this infuriated Nathuram Godse. It's not the only reason why he assassinated Gandhi, as we're going to find out. So this would be an illustration. Of course, Gandhi's own reading of it was that Delhi was in the midst of communal turmoil. It really was. And Gandhi said, I'm going to go on a fast until such time as peace comes to the city. Peace is restored. Right? No mention of the 55 million rupees. And of course, the critics said, well, of course, he can't mention it, you know. Right? But it's not necessary to get into all the nitty-gritty of that. It's to give you an illustration of where one might say, okay, how is a fast, a political fast, different than a fast undertaken by women, such as the Karva Chauth, right? Now, the anthropological view here, which I don't need to elaborate upon because I've really gotten into it. This really more or less is a further elaboration of the argument I've suggested, such as if you look at the last portion of the slide here, where Lakshmi Tewari, a scholar, argued in an article she wrote on women's fast in P, that women undertake fast to assure the overall welfare of their families, especially husbands, sons, and brothers. Right? That has been the anthropological view. Right? Now there are some complexities. One of which is that where do men take their injunction to fast from? Ordinarily, I'm not speaking here of Gandhi. I'm talking about the fact because there are obviously millions of men who go on fast as well. And here again, we're not really looking at the entire canvas, because there are people who go on a fast for all kinds of reasons. People take a vrat. For example, when you do a Maun Vrat, right? So you take a pledge to be silent. So a vrat is a pledge here, which is a pledge to fast in this case, right? And it could be for any number of reasons. Now, we're not looking at the entire canvas of it, but generally men derive their injunction to fast from the Pandits and from the Shastras. That is, that there is a tradition there. How about women? Now, Ravindra Khare, whose work I have used over the years, suggests, in fact, that women often would actually override these priests. They actually went more simply by practice, what was customary, rather than going to the text or rather than going to the scriptural authority, right? And so therefore he suggests that in fact the Shastric text, what they allow or forbid is controverted by these women. And there are other scholars who have gone so far as to say, including the anthropologist S.R. Das, that it's not that women were just rebelling against priestly and Shastric authority, but rather that these fasts were a way of returning to the pre-Vedic Indian past, a past more assertive of femininity and more attuned to the rights of fertility and womanhood. Right? What is indisputably clear is that women's fasts create women's spaces. Women would very often fast together. Men seldom do that. They do it in private. They do it to enhance their ritual status, their purity. Women often, as is the case with Karva Chauth, they get together and they fast. So it's also a way of creating women's spaces. It solidifies her bond to the family, but also links the household to the wider social system from which men often seek to escape when they fast. And what is also very clear is that when men fast, they basically don't do anything else at that time, right? They abjure their normal duties, whereas women continue with their household duties even when they go on a fast. All right. Now, Gandhi had views about the division of labor, the gender division of labor. I think many of us are familiar with that. Unfortunately, I don't really have the time to get into it. And I think the main distinction you have to keep in mind, because Gandhi will appear to be very conservative at times when he's going to talk about women's sphere and women's job of, running the household, raising the children and all of that. But what has been established indubitably by the scholarship, and I think that this is unimpeachably the case, is that whatever Gandhi says, the example he sets at the ashrams is very different. Very different. The practice precedes the theory, so to speak. Because in practice, he was very clear that men and women would do the same work, which they did at the ashram. They worked in the kitchen and they cleaned the toilets. All of them, men and women. He was fully aware of the fact that there is a gender division of labor and its particular relationship to wage labor and political economy, something I hinted at before when I said that women cook at home, but when it's outside, when you're going to get money for it, it's going to be largely men, right? And for him, of course, the real question was, why is it that women's work should be considered demeaning at all? Why should it constitute the grounds for oppression of women by men? His own attentiveness to domesticity in every sense of the term is critically important here. I simply underscore that fact without really getting into it in very great detail. Now, moving to the last step of the argument, and is what I'm suggesting is that what Gandhi sought to do was, given his own ideas about women, that women embody purity, women are much better in ahimsa, they are innately have the power of love, self-sacrifice, all of this, right? But let me be very clear. Let me add this as a caveat that he strongly disagreed with this notion. Because, some of you might say, well, that sounds very patriarchal, this idea of women's purity. But he was absolutely firmly clear that the idea that women are the custodians of women's purity is absolutely absurd. They are not the guardians of women's purity. Because from Gandhi's standpoint, the problem was not women's purity, the problem was men's purity, that they were incapable of it for the most part, certainly in comparison to women, right? So for him, the fundamental question is going to become, given the oppression of women, and this is an argument not specific to India, he is looking at women across the world. How can dignity be restored to women? So he is going to take a number of steps. He links woman to the idea of the soul. Then he searches for a way to inject the body, because it is the body to which the woman has been reduced. This is what it means to sexualize the woman, to objectify her. You reduce her to the body, right? He searches for a way to inject the body into the body politic from which it has been summarily rejected, right? This is what he's going to do. And this is what, so I'm going to skip these slides over here. You have some sense simply from the title, Women as the Supreme Embodiment of Satyagraha, and his whole conception of bringing women into the public sphere. A lot has been written about that, right? What he's going to attempt to do here is to actually say, how is it that we bring women actually into this public sphere, right? How do we inject this body into the body politic? Right? And my submission to you is that the most radical way in which he sought to do that was through his recourse to fasting. Through his recourse to fasting. You have to now keep in mind everything that I've said about the relationship of women to food, right? You have to understand the whole history of, for example, such things like anorexia. You have to understand the whole idea of women's fear and men's fear. all of this is really the backdrop to what he's going to attempt to do over here, right? And so this brings me to the last 4 slides over women's work and the outer world. Now, he's very clear. You see that there are some problems that actually are shared by the country at large, but some problems that chiefly affect women. Because, you know, when you think about yourself, I mean, I want to anticipate someone who says, well, what does it mean to bring women into the public sphere? I mean, of course, lots of women from the 1920s and 30s, you have to read their autobiography, and they'll tell you that had it not been for Gandhi, women couldn't really have come into the public sphere so easily as they did, as it were, become prominent members of the public sphere, venture out into the public, lead processions, lead satyagrahas that Sarojini Naidu did, right? This is an image here of Sarojini Naidu. This is a nationalist print leading the raid on the Darshana salt works, right? All of that. But is there still a kind of a gender stereotyping going on? Because he thought that, well, women should do the picketing of liquor shops, and they should do the picketing of shops that sell foreign cloth. And here I have a discussion of why these two were important, where women themselves said that these two are the most important thing. For example, liquor shops, because liquor was devastating Indian homes. And many of you are aware of the fact that India is one of the few countries in the world where in most states in India, payday, the day you get paid, usually the 1st or the 7th of the month in most states, all liquor shops are closed, so that men can't go with their paycheck to the liquor shop and squander half their wealth, half their monthly salary that day on liquor, right? And there are women who themselves will say, this is the crucial thing, right? If you look at this last portion of this quote over here, and I'll have this talk up on my YouTube channel if people want to look up some of these slides in greater detail at that point, right? That women themselves promoted this idea that we want to do this too. It's not simply Gandhi said that this is what you should be doing. All right. So to conclude, when I speak of the gender of fasting, I'm saying that in the first place, we must undermine the commonly held distinction between women's fasts, which are assumed to be domestic and private, and men's fasts, which are assumed to belong to the political and the public. Women's fasts were, if anything, more public or social. They could be confined to the family, but they were seldom conducted only with a view to gaining prestige or enhancing one's spiritual status. I want you to go back for a moment. I had mentioned that there's an instance of fasting, upvas, referred to in the Valmiki Ramayana. What is that instance? That instance is when Dashrath is told by Kaikeyi that you have to give these 2 boons to me, and these 2 boons are that you shall send Bharat into exile for donkey's ears, as I would say, right? Sorry, not Bharat, Ram into exile. And you shall install my son, Bharat, on the throne. He shall become king of Ayodhya. And Valmiki's Ramayana says, when Dashrath heard this, he shook. And when he falters and tries to find a way out. And so there's a conversation that goes on, and then Kaikeyi says, if you do not give me these boons, I shall, from this moment onwards, stop eating. I shall stop eating. Now, there is a domestic context in many Indian homes, because this is one of the ways in which women can leverage power. But they can really leverage this power when, for example, you have a male child. Because if the male child then says, I'm going to stop eating because my mother is not eating, right? That has an influence on the father. You'd have to really look at the very small ethnographies to see whether people are talking about this, right? So I am saying that the private is indeed the political. Shorn of power, women could use the power derived from food, from its preparation, its distribution, serving it, and finally, from abstaining from eating it altogether to leverage some power against fathers and especially husbands. And it is from his observance of fasting in the home that Gandhi came to the conclusion that satyagraha is just as viable at home as it is in the wider public spheres, even at the level of the nation. There is no difference at all. He was adamant about that for decades in his writings. And what I'm therefore trying to suggest is that what we have to think about is the various ways in which Gandhi attempted to feminize Indian politics. This means many different things. It means bringing love, self-sacrifice, and the capacity of suffering, the capacity for bearing the cross, all of which begins with his view of women and their innate capacity for ahimsa. Now, ordinarily, such feminization is understood as simply as bringing women into the public sphere. There's something of that, and extending women's activities into this public sphere. But I'm suggesting it entailed a great deal more. It entailed a considerable labor on Gandhi's part to bring the polity into the body politic. Right? And finally, let us not forget that the masculinists, those who believe in a muscular foreign policy, those who believe in a muscular India, those who believe then and back then, right, including Gandhi's assassin, of course, they have always ridiculed such things like fasting. Ridiculed. There's no other word for it. There is a very interesting debate. I discussed this debate at very great length in one of the chapters of my book. A very interesting debate that took place in the Imperial Legislative Council of India. So this is what I called a voice from the UK, because he's a Britisher, even though he's in India, right? And in this debate, you see, a bill had been introduced. The bill had to do with what is called the cat and mouse provision. This goes back to England itself. That, you know, when hunger strikers were put into jail, what would happen? The British decided that they would force feed them. This is what they attempted to do with Jatin Das and Bhagat Singh. They would attempt to force feed them, right? And this would create a real uproar, and then they would release them. They would release them, and then these people would be brought back into prison, and then again they would try to force feed them. And so this cycle went on going this way, right? So this bill that was being introduced was a bill which attempted to say that we are not going to pander to these hunger strikers. We're going to let them die. We're not going to force feed them because that creates an uproar. Then we say, okay, we're not going to force feed them. We're going to be humane. And what do? Then these people, they go back on the hunger strike and cause an embarrassment to the government, right? So this bill is introduced, and he says, E.L. Price, in this debate, that this strategy adopted by the hunger strikers is a revival of the old feminine trick in a new form. The argument being that women will never play straight politics. Straight politics meant to do it the British way. Be suited and booted, make the right speeches, work within constitutional means, right? Abstention from food, he says, is the feminine sulky trick adopted by prisoners under trial. And what is his counterpart in India? An Indian. What is the Indian counterpart? And this is what I conclude with. It is the voice of Nathuram Godse, the assassin of Gandhi, who in a speech at the Red Fort in his defense, published some years later, because initially it was proscribed by the government of India, published in a book called May It Please Your Honor, says, quote, I firmly believe that the teachings of absolute ahimsa as advocated by Gandhiji would ultimately result in the emasculation, notice the word, emasculation of the Hindu community. The Hindu community is going to become effeminate if we follow Gandhi's way. What is Gandhi's way? Gandhi's politics was, quote, supported by old superstitious beliefs, such as the power of the soul, the inner voice, the fast, the prayer, and the purity of mind. These are the ways, says Godse, of women and of hijras. And I stop with that. Thank you very much. I apologize for taking a little bit longer than I had planned to.
Thank you so much, Professor Vinay Lal. It was really, really intriguing, energizing, really enlightening talk. And I'm sure everybody learned so much new about Gandhi's life. We say we know about Gandhi, but we know so little until we hear your enlightening talks and read your books and papers. We would love to, of course, share on your YouTube channel, my YouTube channel, Flame University's YouTube channel, and I hope more and more people will connect Gandhi's past to so many traditions in Europe that I had no clue about also. We would love to invite questions and your answers. So let's see if any questions from the audience, they can either type in the chat window, or there's also Q&A window. So quickly, please, Professor Lal has to go to some urgent meeting after this. So while we wait for other questions, I have a small question, Professor Vinay Lal.
Yeah.
You refer to Salekhna in passing,
Yes.
but can we and then can we connect the fasting tradition of Jainism, in which Mahavir, the 24th Tirthankar, the historical figure of Jainism, the 24th Tirthankar, apparently for 12.5 years that he was doing his tapasya from the day he took Diksha, and then the day he attained Kaivalya Gyan. For those 12.5 years, apparently he fasted for almost 11 years.
That's right.
So can we place the tradition of fasting, maybe in India at least, most publicly done fasting from Mahavira? Do you think and related to that is my question with women, apparently also in Jain Sangha, Jain monasteries, or Jain community as a whole, women have always been more than men, starting from the time of Mahavir.
Yeah.
And of course, all monks and nuns and lay people are all encouraged to fast and fast and fast all the time in Jainism. So do you think, so where do we put those fasts? Are they public, private? Because they're all doing it. Men, women, lay people, ascetics, everybody's doing it. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, that I think that, if we had to have, a very broad canvas, which I've already indicated that there are things that I've had to omit here, but I myself, as you said, invoked the whole idea of Salekna. But yes, I think that the practices of Mahavir were important. I mean, the only thing here is that there is no question that Jainism was important for Gandhi. Vaishnava practices were important for Gandhi. And that whole area where he grew up was really an area where there were melange of religious influences. Okay. And there's a lot of work that's been done on that. The only difficulty here is that, at least in Gandhi's own writings, and when I say writings, I'm including the public discourses which are included in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, you don't really see many invocations of Mahavir. I don't doubt that he obviously held his life up as an example, but both the Buddha and Mahavir do not appear that often in Gandhi's writings at all, for various reasons, I think. But I think that if you're looking at the practices of the Jains, I think that left an impression on Gandhi's mind. And I think, the Jain practice, this is really in some ways has to be viewed in relation to Salekna, if I may put it this way. There's the very charming description of it in a very modern book. This is Suketu Mehta's book on Maximum City on Bombay, where in the very last chapter, he describes this very wealthy Jain merchant, diamond merchant, who basically does what is very common in the Jain tradition. He gives up his entire wealth, and then he goes with a begging bowl from home to home for his meals. A man who was like a billionaire, as it were, right? Okay. Now you see, it's just like you shed the flesh. This is a different way, right? So I think all of this was important. Gandhi's whole idea of nakedness. Nakedness. Exactly. What did he say?
Yes.
My ambition in life is? My ambition in life is to reduce myself to zero, shunyata. Yeah,
Wow. Mm.
it is.
Yes.
It is has to be the case that Jainism was present in his mind when he was thinking of all of this as well.
Mm.
That would be
Yeah,
my
I think
answer.
right. Even I think name of Mahavir, I'm not probably not even once he mentioned in his autobiography.
Very
Even the
seldom.
name of Srimad Rajchandra he mentioned only 3 or 4 times. With
Yes,
him,
yes,
whom
but
he
he did
wrote
have
letters
a
for 6 years.
correspondence with him. But he did.
6 years, right? From South
There's
Africa. Yes, yes,
he
yes.
did have a correspondence with him, and
Right,
in the
right.
collected works he appears quite a few
Yes,
times.
yes, yes. All
Yeah,
right. Okay, great.
yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Other question is from Shikha Sharma. And the question is, in the Hindu tradition, where do we place the notion of vrata? Is it under bhakti or karma or jnana marg?
Yeah, is it
Vrat,
under
yeah.
bhakti or karam marg or gyan marg? Uh, well, you see, it would really be more under, if you ask me, it would be more under bhakti or, you know, karma or karam marg, work, devotion. But I don't know that this is how necessarily it would be parceled out. That is to say that, you see, the idea of, because what is a vrat? It's a pledge, it's a vow. When you take a mon vrat, what is it? It's a pledge of silence, right? It's a pledge of silence. Now, is it only particular to those who are bhaktas or those who have gone on the path of gyan? I don't know that one would necessarily, the text may say something, but remember always that we have a very different relationship to text in India than we do in the Western tradition. This is why I also made a distinction between what Gandhi writes, because he's aware of a constituency. He's always aware of a constituency. And Madhu Keshwar, in her better days, if I may put it this way, when she was working on interesting questions in an interesting way, she wrote a long essay called Gandhi and Women. The essay goes back to 1984. And one of the arguments she made was that, when you read Gandhi on women, he sounds very conventional, very patriarchal. But she says, then see what he did at the ashram, see what he did in the
Mhm.
Satyagraha movement and the salt Satyagraha, see what he did in the non-cooperation movement. That is, the practice for him set the example. And he knew that that's what Indians went by. That is the other argument that she wants to make, right? So this is what I would suggest, that when we're really looking at the idea of vrat, okay, and there are many kinds of vrats, we have to see what are the practices that have been invested in that.
All right. There is a comment by Professor Maya Dord at Flame University, my colleague. There is a fabulous book by Alan
Feldman,
Feldman
yes.
on his called
Formation of violence.
Formations of Violence. Yeah.
Yes, I saw that. I've got the chat box open, so I saw that. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Any other question? I have not seen any other question from anybody else.
We have 10
And
minutes to,
yeah,
yeah.
yes. If not anybody, maybe I can ask one more question.
Yeah.
Do you think this methodology is still valid? Do you think Anna Hazare tried the similar methodology, or do you think that's completely different?
Well, I mean, I don't want to be really very unkind. You see, Anna Hazare and Mohandas Gandhi, the difference is miles apart. Because, I mean,
right.
look, I don't want to be that uncharitable, because, but Anna Hazare, what was the whole campaign fought over? Let's first begin with that. Over something called corruption. Well, what is corruption? What is corruption? He doesn't really have any understanding of corruption, frankly. Corruption is not simply the fact that आपने अगर license देना है या मैंने license देना है तो पैसे देने पड़ते हैं किसी को. That's corruption, of course, but thousands of things are corruption. If an ambassador is appointed to a country who is not a member of the professional diplomatic service in the US, almost all ambassadorial appointments, the vast majority of them, are given to people who are not professional diplomats. They're not part of the American Foreign Service. They're given as a reward for someone who gave $5 million donation to the party that won the election. Well, that's corruption, if you ask me. Okay, it's plain corruption. But I don't only mean corruption in that sense, that first you have to ask about the corruption of the soul, as Gandhi would have said. Now, someone like Anna Hazare has no diagnosis of Indian society whatsoever, because he has no diagnosis of the self to begin with. So something called thought is very remote from his way of thinking, so to speak, if I may put it this way. All right, that was one issue. I actually wrote on Anna Hazare's, Anshan. Yeah, I wrote an article in the Times of India, a very long article called "Fast, Counter Fast, Anti-Fast," because there is a very long tradition in India of this kind of targeted political fasting that he was doing. This is very different from Gandhi's fasts, which invariably also involved the whole philosophy of what he called the inner voice, that you only go on the fast when the voice beckons you. And there is a Quaker tradition of that, of the inner voice, for example, as well. Now, you see, we have to start probing the whole idea of the Atma, the Antaratma, the inner soul, and what Gandhi understood by it, right? So what my submission here is simply this, that no, I mean, he made that Anna Hazare was trying to make a political gesture of a certain kind. And of course, he realized that there is a tradition of, quote, hunger striking. Okay. His fast seems to me to be more akin to a hunger strike, because he's making demands on others. The first question is, what is the demand he makes on himself? That's the first question. And the answer is, we don't know, because he never was able to articulate it. He's saying, I'm going on this because I want to stop corruption. That's like Gandhi saying, I'm going to go on a fast because I want to stop the partition of India. Right? I mean, I often get the question from people who are very critical of Gandhi, but then they say, why didn't Gandhi go on a fast during the partition? Which curiously means that they think that Gandhi actually had the power to stop partition through his fast. On the one hand, they want to say he was completely useless, but on the other hand, they say, why didn't he go on a fast at the time of partition? Right? So this is the nature of the problem, you know? Yeah.
One more question from Vinita Chandra. The question is, I think tapas seems to me to be central to the idea of upvas. Did Gandhi mention this, or can it be gleaned from his speeches?
Answers
all kinds
is
of corrupt could participate in the Annam because of the,
yeah. The answer to the first question is that did Gandhi mention this? Yes, he did. I mean, there is what I call a grammar of satyagraha, and that includes satya, ahimsa, brahmacharya, tapasya, sadhana, all of these. And so, yes, tapasya is part of that. It's certainly important to the idea of upvas. I mentioned that, you see the capacity. Why does he think that women, they can bear the cross? Their capacity for taking the suffering of someone upon themselves is greater than the capacity that men have. That is what it means to carry the burden of the cross, right? To use the metaphor from Christianity here. Right? So, and did Gandhi mention this? Yes. And can it be gleaned from his speeches? Undoubtedly. Yeah.
Okay. I guess that's it. Those are the questions. And so once again, thank you. And if you have any concluding thoughts, we can hear a bit more.
No, I think I have said what I had to say. I mean, I wasn't actually able to do the recording, but when you share the recording with me, I will put it up.
Definitely.
And I invite people who, even those who listen to it, that they can go through the slides more carefully, because there were a number of quotations. Simone Weil, whom I mentioned there, is someone that I hope we in India will become more aware of, because she is one of the most extraordinary figures of the 20th century, and a major figure of non-violence as well. Really quite an extraordinary.
Really enlightening that you shared that. Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with those thoughts, I guess once again, thank you so much.
Sure.
We look
Thank you
forward to
very much.
inviting you more. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. Bye bye.